Good afternoon, everyone. Our lesson today will be about biodiversity and endemism. Our learning objective will be we should know that over time, variety of life has become extensive and it's now being threatened by human activity. And secondly, what's meant by the term biodiversity and the term endemism. What is biodiversity? Biodiversity is an important word right now because of Earth's biological diversity, which has become extensive over millions of years of evolution, is reducing rapidly. So the biodiversity that was very varied and very extensive millions of years ago, now it's becoming rapidly reducing. The main important reason for this is the direct result of human activity. And then you are going to learn why is biodiversity important. And thirdly, you are going to assess biodiversity. Finally, you will learn more about endemism. Defining biodiversity. If you look for the number of different species worldwide, if you know that we have 100 million different species of animals, plants, fungi, microbial organisms living on Earth, variety of the habitats in which they live, scientists can estimate that we have more than 10 million different species inhabiting Earth. But is this a good definition for biodiversity? What we can say here is the concept is useful, but the real definition of biodiversity should be more complex. The differences between individuals in species, between population of the same species, between communities, and between ecosystems are all examples of biodiversity. Some examples of biodiversity include differences between individuals, in species, and then the difference between population of the same species, difference between communities, and between ecosystems. All of those are considered as examples of biodiversity. Let me remind you with the definitions of population, community, and ecosystem. Population is a group of organisms that belong to the same species, but live in the same area and interact with one another. Community is all the populations of different species that live in the same area and interacting. Ecosystem is made of biotic and abiotic factors in an area. So include all species of living organisms that live together and they're interacting with their abiotic factors in their environment. Abiotic factors like with air, water, atmosphere, and so on. The level of organization is very clear here that this is an organism which live in a species. The group of the living organism of the same species that live together, they form the population, and the community is a group of different species that live and interact together, while here is the interaction between the species and their between different species of living organisms and their environment, which form the ecosystem, which is a part of our biodiversity. Assessing biodiversity. Biodiversity can be assessed from two different scales. The first scale is species level that live in a habitat, and the second level is genetic level in a population. So species level in a habitat and genetic level in a population. So in this way, we can modify the term biodiversity or the concept of biodiversity to include genetic diversity, which means the difference between genes in a population. So the term biodiversity would be assessed by adding the term genetic diversity to it. Genetic diversity include diversity of uh, population within a species and diversity of different species in a community and the difference between different ecosystem, okay, uh, in the globe. Why is biodiversity important? Of course, we can consider this as a very complex and very long question. We can summarize many different reasons here. The most important reason is the ecosystem are in. So first, we can say that ecosystems are interdependent, means that an ecosystem depends on events happening in another ecosystem in such a way that all the globe is connected. Secondly, uh, rich biodiversity allows a large scale ecosystem to function and to self-regulate. We mean here that if the biodiversity is very rich in many different types of living organisms, this allows large-scale ecosystem to function because any living organism in an ecosystem is dependent on another organism or in existence and the abundance of another organism. Three, if a natural balance is destroyed in an area or in an ecosystem, the biodiversity will be affected or might be destroyed in a different areas. Four, many organisms are important for air and water purification, decomposition of waste. We're still summarizing why studying of biodiversity is very important. We are continuing with the reason why the range of organisms helps in purifying air and water, which is very important for human beings. Many living organisms decompose waste like bacteria and fungi, and we have an example here, bacteria that convert ammonia in the soil into nitrates. It can be absorbed by green plants. You know, green plants need nitrates to make their own proteins. There are many types of bacteria that can convert the ammonia into nitrates in the soil in a process that we call it ammonification or fixing ammonia. Another importance for studying biodiversity is the photosynthesis. Photosynthesis process helps stabilizing the carbon dioxide level in the atmosphere. You know that green plants make photosynthesis, absorbing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. In this way, they help to stabilize the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Nine, transpiration helps reducing rain. You know that when the plants transpire, they lose excess water in the form of vapor. Vapor make clouds, and then clouds will make rain. And you know why rain is very important for cultivation, for filling ponds and swamps, and so on. Plant roots hold the soil together. So plant roots, long roots of the plants, branched roots, or the roots that are occupied by some mycelium fungus. This make like a very branching system which help to hold the soil particles together, and here it will reduce the risk of flooding. Biodiversity also affect the pollination, seed dispersal, soil fertility, and the nutrient recycling in the ecosystem. Biodiversity provides genetic variation to develop crops, livestock, and forests. Forests should be occupied with varieties of living organisms from many different species as per any living organism depend on another one. In absence of any species in a forest, this will affect the diversity or the biodiversity of many different species, as all species that live together in an ecosystem are interdependent. The same way, presence of biodiversity help us as scientists to develop new crops using genetic engineering, new livestock, and so on. Biodiversity also allow crossbreeding and genetic engineering. Crossbreeding, because if you have two different species or closely related species, you can crossbreed them in order to get a higher rate of the product or make the living organism more productive or to increase the size of crop and so on. And again, biodiversity help to cope with problems arising from climate change and diseases. Some diseases that can arise, uh, we cannot find any solution for them unless we need to go to the biodiversity, go to our ecosystem, looking for new plants to grow or to develop new crops in order to solve a problem or to solve a problem or to minimize a climatic condition or a disease. And lastly, plant biodiversity provide potential to produce chemicals. Many medicines or most of the medicines originally they are generated from plants, from some plants. This is why it's very important to study biodiversity. But how to assess the biodiversity, how to find the quality of the biodiversity in an ecosystem or in a group of ecosystem in the globe. If we are looking for the species level, we have 2 points we need to look for when you need to assess biodiversity. First is species richness. Secondly is relative species abundance. What is species richness? From the meaning, from the term, you can identify the meaning. The richness means many, the number of species in an ecosystem. So the varieties of different species in an ecosystem, this, we call this species richness. Relative species abundance. So it's one species and you are looking for the abundance of the species. We mean the evenness of the distribution of different species in an ecosystem. So if you have an area, we are looking for how the species are distributed. Suppose we have three different species or two different species of organisms. Here we can say that those two different species are evenly distributed. Whereas if you draw them like this, so they are in the same number, but the distribution is uneven. Okay, this what do you mean by relative species abundance? The evenness of the distribution of different species in an ecosystem. Species richness means how many species do we have? So we can have two areas. One of them have like three or four different species, while another area has only two species. So we can say here that the species on the right is less rich than the species on the left, as it does contain fewer number of species than the one on the left. Species richness, it involves the number of species in an area or in an ecosystem. Looking up here at the figure A and figure B, you can see that in figure A, there are more species than on figure B. Here you can see we have one, two, three different species on the figure on the left, while the one on the right does have only two different species. So I can say that area A is more rich than area B. Species richness and diversity, there is a difference between two terms. Species, richness is the number of different species in an area, while species diversity measures both richness and the relative abundance. If you compare forest A with forest B, you will see that both of them have the same species richness. They contain the same number of species. While we can say that forest A has a higher species diversity because the relative abundance of species are more similar here. So more evenness of or more distribution of species. You can see here the different distribution of species in different areas in the world. So we can consider those areas. There are 25 areas around the world that we can consider them very rich in species distribution. We call those areas hotspots of biodiversity. Endemism is a term which means the number of endemic species in an area. But what the term endemic means? Endemic means a species that evolves in geographical isolation and is found in only one place, like an area which has been separated by a barrier. If you have a piece of land and then the piece of land has been separated by a barrier like a mountain, so the species that were living together now are geographically isolated. So in these two areas, the organisms are going to evolve in a different way, producing two different species of living organism. And because the organism cannot go to the other species because they are now separated, so we can say they exist only in this area, and we call them an endemic to this particular area of the land. When a species evolves in one place, it's said to be an endemic. Here, this is Madagascar. It's an area in east of Africa. It was one land one day, but it has been separated and became an isolated island. Now, the living organisms that live in Madagascar are completely different from the living organisms that live in the rest of the East Africa. In some areas in the world, you can see marsupials animals are endemic. What are marsupials animals? Marsupial animals, they are unlike other placental mammals, such as humans, dogs, and whales, because they give birth to undeveloped or underdeveloped young that continue to grow in a pouch in the mother's body. Let's watch this video to learn more about what are biodiversity hotspots. A biodiversity hotspot is a biogeographic region that is both a significant reservoir of biodiversity, means it has very high species richness, and in the same time is threatened with destruction. The term biodiversity hotspot specifically refers to 25 biological rich areas around the world that have lost at least 70% of their original habitat. You can see here the 25 different hotspots around the world that were considered very rich areas in species diversity, but they are threatened from being extinct. We have some facts here. They occupy 15.7% of Earth's land surface. They are home to 77% of terrestrial animals. They are areas of many resources that people want to use. Why it's so difficult to prioritize areas for conservation? Because the areas that has very high species biodiversity are not always the areas with the greatest number of endemic species. So why some areas have very rich biodiversity? Because they have either very stable ecosystem, and this allows many complex relationships to develop between species. 2. High levels of productivity. When the rate of photosynthesis, for example, is very high, this can support many niches. 3. High rate of growth and reproduction. This allows more mutations to occur, resulting in developing more adaptive features, and this allows the organism to occupy more niche. We have an example here as a result of Madagascar's long isolation from neighboring continents. It's a home for vast variety of plants and animals, many found nowhere else on the planet. Approximately 80% of the plant and animal species are existing in Madagascar. Almost all species here are endemic to the island, while the imported ones can cause many problems to endemic species. So now let's watch this video to learn more about Madagascar endemic species. We have another example here of an endemic animals. These are 4 species of pupfish that live in USA. Those 4 species of desert fish have different coloring and courtship displays. Watch this video to learn more about the endemic species of those kinds of fish in USA. Another term here, species abundance. What is species abundance? Species abundance is a measure of the relative number of different types of the organisms. An even abundance of different species is more biodiverse than the one containing the same number of species but dominated by 1 or 2 species. Let's take an example to understand it more. You can see here 2 communities of living organisms. Both of them have the same number of species, so they have the same species richness, but the distribution of species is even in community A and diverged in community B. So we can say that community A has more diverse than community B because the number of the different species are more evenly spaced. But some areas in the world are much more vulnerable to damage and loss than other areas. Let's watch this video to dig up more. But which ecosystems are much more vulnerable than others? It was found that the small isolated ecosystems are much more vulnerable to damage. Because the organisms that live in the small ecosystem, they are isolated, they interbreed and interact actively with each other. Any change in the small ecosystem, a change in the population density, or in the distribution of organisms or species would affect the biodiversity of the whole ecosystem because they are closely related and dependent into one another. These areas are also the biodiversity hotspots because they have most of the species in the world. So if they are damaged, we expect that many species will be lost. In this way, we can say that extinction in any one species would decrease the biodiversity. Also, we can expect that if a new species has been evolved, this would increase the biodiversity in the same area. Now we are done with the lesson. Let's solve some questions. Question 1. Using the maps in figure D, describe how the areas of high bird biodiversity and high bird endemic differ, and explain why this might be. This is figure D, which shows the endemic areas and the areas that are very rich in species richness. Let's recall the question using the map. Describe how the areas of high bird biodiversity and high bird endemism differ, and explain why it might be. The high bird biodiversity means a large number of different species. High endemism means large number of species that evolved in that place. High biodiversity may be the result of high endemism, but it may also be due to bird species from other areas moving into an area. An area of high endemism may only include a few species of bird that evolved in situ and not on large number of different species, as on islands, which might explain the high levels of endemism on the Indonesian island, which were not areas of high species richness. Question 2. He was asking, suggest why endemic population often have low genetic diversity. Why the areas that have endemic population have low genetic diversity. This is because they were founded by a small number of individuals that would have had a small gene pool. Allele frequencies would not necessarily reflect a normal population, as all subsequent generations are descended from the small number of individuals. Genetic diversity is lower than in a population in which there can be genetic movement in and out. Now we are done with the lesson 4C1. If you have any question, please post your answers on the digital campus or on the video on the YouTube. Thank you.